to bring thousands and thousands of businesses and trillions of dollars in wealth back to the good old USA.
He tries to coerce us from supporting Ukraine. We need to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression. Russia attacked another country. That's a blatant violation of international law.
Oh, we get to go home a day early. You know what? I mean, the hardworking average American out there doesn't get to leave a day early. They need a government that's not incompetent.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland, CBS News, Washington. Welcome to America Decides. With 42 days until the election, former President Donald Trump was in Savannah, Georgia today, outlining his plan to lower taxes for American businesses. Governor Tim Walz was stumping for Vice President Kamala Harris today at a campaign event in St. Paul, Minnesota. Harris is back on the trail in Pittsburgh tomorrow, and CBS News has learned she's considering a trip to the southern border on Friday. Also today, President Biden delivers his final speech to the United Nations General Assembly, addressing the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine.
Putin's war has failed, and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free.
NATO's Secretary General spoke to our Weijia Jiang about the president's speech and more. We'll hear from him ahead on America Decides. But first, Robert Costa and Aaron Navarro join us with the latest on the race from the White House. Robert, let's start with you. We know Donald Trump was pledging an economic-focused speech today. How much of the speech was focused on the economy?
Great to be with you, Scott, from here in Battleground, Georgia. Former President Trump came here for the first time in about 2 months because this remains a contest that's up in the air, based on my conversations with strategists and advisors to both candidates. And you see former President Trump talking about his trade message today a few miles north to the east in Savannah, Georgia. And you have him trying to underscore to the working voters in Georgia and elsewhere that his policies on trade, calling for more tariffs, are going to protect workers. And this comes as Vice President Kamala Harris is making her own overtures to working voters in Georgia and elsewhere, trying to lock arms with labor, whether it's the UAW or others.
Well, if he's pledging to stay focused on issues, if his campaign wants him to stay focused on issues, Bob, how focused did he seem today? Did he deviate? Did he dovetail into other topics?
As usual, Scott, he definitely dovetailed. He went into some tangential issues, expressed some grievances about how the campaign has been run, about how Vice President Harris is proceeding with her own bid. And you have former President Trump at this point deciding not to participate in another campaign debate. And that has led to this crossroads in this race where there's really no other juncture on the horizon that's going to bring Harris and Trump together. And so Trump, I'm told by some of his confidants, is trying to reset his campaign in a way by going into this final stretch, by going back to the core issues of the economy, immigration, and trade, and casting himself as the outside candidate. And there's a belief in Trump's inner circle that if he's just himself on the trail, and as you say, he's going to sometimes talk about the economy, but sometimes talk about political attacks against Vice President Harris, that if Trump is just Trump, he can maybe find that sweet spot politically just like he did in October 2016. But there are skeptics in the Republican Party. They want to see Trump focus on Harris, focus on the economy, not talk about her in any sort of personal way.
Aaron, let's switch over to you. You're covering a Republicans for Harris Walz event in Pennsylvania today. What are you hearing at the event? What are the voters saying about it?
Yeah, Scott, good to be with you. I am just across the street from the building that hosted the event where a slate of never-Trumpers, former Congress members Barbara Comstock, Jim Greenwood, as well as Joe Walsh, who primaried Trump in 2020, talked and laid out the stakes to these moderate Republican and some Democrats I've found in the room, voters, about why they think Trump is unfit for office. And I talked to a Republican voter who's voting for Harris and a Republican voter who's still undecided what they think about the Harris campaign making outreaches to Republican voters. Here's what they had to say. This is, like a Republicans for Harris event. What do you make of the Harris campaign trying to be a bit more bipartisan in their approach?
I like that if they're genuine about it and listening to both sides and hearing what the people really want. And there's a lot of really important issues out there.
You know, I've never been a part of something like this where the opposite party is coming in and saying, yeah, man, we're gonna do a little event for you. We're going to make you feel welcome. We're going to hear you out. And I'm really happy that the Harris campaign is reaching out to Republicans like myself.
Now, it's still a bit of an uphill battle here in Lancaster County. Biden lost by double digits. On the way here, there were more Trump Vance signs than Harris wall signs. But the Harris campaign does believe that shaving off the margins in counties like this can help them win the state and rebuild and maybe expand the coalition Biden saw in 2020.
And we know she goes to Pittsburgh tomorrow, which has been a focus, at least where her positioning has been over the past few weeks. What is she set to talk about with these economic proposals she's pledging?
Yeah, she's been in Pennsylvania maybe once a week the past month. In Pittsburgh, she's expected to lay out more of her economic plans. Now, so far, we have heard her plans for affordable housing, small businesses, as well as a child tax credit, expanding that. But further details on what she would do to lower grocery prices is something that voters want to hear more about, and we're expected to get more expansive details tomorrow in Pittsburgh.
Aaron, can you give us a sense of how saturated the airwaves are in that part of Pennsylvania, or any part of Pennsylvania you've been in the last few weeks?
It's either a Harris ad, a Trump ad, a McCormick ad, or a Casey ad. And that's been the case since about a month and a half ago when I was tracking Governor Josh Shapiro as he was a potential running mate for Harris. So certainly the airwaves are littered with campaign ads because they know this is a crucial state for both camps to win this November.
Yeah, I was talking with the operator of a radio station in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who says if we had more airtime to give, we'd be able to sell it in a minute. Bob, let me go back to you. We know that there's reporting Vice President Harris is considering a trip to the southern border as early as Friday. What does that say to you, and how is she navigating this issue of border security?
She knows, based on my conversations with her allies, that former President Trump is going to have this drumbeat on immigration and border security between now and Election Day. And by going down to the border, it gives her an opportunity to counter Trump's messaging, because she might not have that opportunity on a debate stage in the coming weeks. So you see her trying to take this issue head on, because she also knows, I'm told, that on social media, Republicans and Trump allies are constantly referring to her as the border czar. Democrats always say she was asked by President Biden to work on root causes of migration to the United States, but that specificity does not always come across in social media posts by some Republicans. And she knows, though, that that message from GOP critics persists. And so by going to the border, she's trying to come to the issue of the border and immigration on her own terms in this closing stretch. And it is something that some Democrats feel there's a vulnerability on politically, even if they feel the facts are in their favor or her arguments are fine, that they want to make sure that Trump isn't out there each and every day on his own terms defining the race on that front.
Robert Costas in Georgia, Aaron Navarro in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which all three of us know is just beautiful this time of year. Good reporting, both of you. Thank you very much. And this quick programming note, you can join us here on CBS News 24/7 early on October 1st, 4 p.m. Eastern, for our special vice presidential debate edition of America Decides. That is live in New York City before CBS News moderates the debate and brings you coverage all night long.
Our main focus is Ukraine and to mobilize support to Ukraine.
Coming up, we speak to NATO's Secretary General as world leaders gather in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In his final speech to the United Nations General Assembly, President Biden said he sees the world's challenges but has hope there's a way forward. He also emphasized his support for Ukraine in its war against Russia.
The good news is Putin's war has failed, and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free. He set out to weaken NATO, but NATO is bigger, stronger, and more united than ever before.
Weijia Jiang joins us now from the United Nations in New York. And Weijia, we know you spoke with the NATO Secretary General about a range of issues today, including the war in Ukraine. What did he have to tell you?
Yes, we did, Scott, and we spoke to him shortly after President Biden delivered his remarks, which really was an effort for the president to cement his legacy on foreign policy. And not only did Biden speak about Ukraine, but he also touched on all the things that the administration has done under his leadership investing in climate change and trying to broker a ceasefire in Gaza. But with regard to Ukraine, which of course is the Secretary General's main concern here, he did talk about Biden's leadership in this effort and what he's looking for in the next few days, especially as President Zelensky makes a speech before this group. President Zelensky has been very clear about what he believes could help him win, and that is the use of long-range missiles into Russia. Of course, you know what Putin has said about that. He said if, the West allows that to happen, then that would mean the West is now in the war with Russia. But you recently called his bluff on this because you said we've heard these sorts of things from Putin before. So do you not take his words at face value here?
He has threatened us again and again since the start of this war, when we delivered advanced artillery, advanced battle tanks, fighter jets, and now he threatens us again. He tries to coerce us from supporting Ukraine. We need to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression. Russia attacked another country. That's a blatant violation of international law. According to international law, Ukraine has the right to self-defense, and that includes also the right to strike legitimate military targets on the territory of the aggressor, Russia. Some allies have no restrictions on the use of their weapons. Others have imposed some kind of restrictions, but also those allies have actually loosened the restrictions over the last months. I welcome that, and also welcome that we have an ongoing consultations on this issue in NATO.
But from your view, do you believe that Ukraine should be able to use these long-range missiles?
I believe that what you have seen so far, that some allies have loosened the restrictions, is the right way to go, and I welcome that we continue to work on these issues. The challenge is that in a war there are no risk-free options. But I strongly believe that the biggest risk will be if President Putin wins, because that will send a message to him that when he used military force, he gets what he wants. And that's also not only a challenge for Europe, but also something we will see in Asia, because the war in Ukraine is followed closely in Beijing. So as the Japanese Prime Minister actually told me yesterday in a meeting, what happens in Ukraine today can happen in Asia tomorrow. So this is about standing up for international law and prevent authoritarian regimes from believing that they can get what they want by using military force.
We have seen President Biden be convinced on the Abrams tanks, on the fighter jets, and change his position. Will you try to convince President Biden to change his stance on these long-range missiles?
Well, as I said, this is part of an ongoing conversation among NATO allies, and also the United States has loosened its restrictions because not so many months ago, Russia opened a total new front. And until then, most of the fighting in Ukraine had taken place deep inside Ukrainian territory. But when the Russians opened the front in the Kharkiv region, the front line and the borderline was more or less the same. And of course, then it doesn't give any meaning to say that you cannot fire behind the front lines. And then the United States loosened up the restrictions on the use of their weapons. And I think it's absolute value in now seeing if there are so the potential of loosening up even more. But again, I think these conversations should take place among allies. That's the best way of addressing these issues.
Of course, a parallel conversation is whether Ukraine will ever be able to join NATO. What do you say to that?
Well, Ukraine should and must join NATO. They have made it clear they would like to join NATO. NATO allies have made it clear that they should become a member. So what we are discussing is not if, but when. And I think we need to understand that at some stage this war has to end. And when the war ends, we need to be sure that this is really the end.
Of course, there is another conflict going on in Gaza, and NATO does not have a unanimous agreement, the countries, about the approach. So how would you describe NATO's view on how to end that war and whether a united front is necessary first?
So we are deeply concerned about the escalation, the suffering, and of course that's also the reason why I welcome that the United States and other allies, the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, have now taken initiatives or are working hard to try to find a peaceful way forward to de-escalate, to have the release of the hostages, but also, of course, a ceasefire. NATO is the answer to many problems in the world, but NATO is not the answer to every problem.
And that is the message that President Biden sent as well, Scott, that now is the time to finalize that ceasefire agreement. And one other note, President Biden, even though this is not a political speech, did get a bit nostalgic, and he had a message to foreign leaders. He said that some things are more important than staying in power, and it's the people who matter the most. That, of course, is significant given the fact that he stepped down from the top of the Democratic presidential ticket, paving the way for Vice President Harris. Scott.
Busy day at the UN in New York. Weijia Jiang, thank you very much.
Sure.
Keeping the lights on, at least through the election. Our Nicole Killian's on Capitol Hill with the latest on a deal to avert a government shutdown. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We're following a very busy day on Capitol Hill today, where lawmakers are preparing to vote on a 3-month spending bill as early as tomorrow in an effort to avert a government shutdown next week. Additionally, the Republican-led House Foreign Affairs Committee today advanced an effort to hold Secretary of State Antony Blinken in contempt of Congress. Nicole Killian, my teammate, is here to talk about all this and talk about more. Nicole, let's start off with the state of play for this looming government shutdown. We know they need a pretty high threshold now to pass this bill. What's the latest you're hearing?
Well, the latest is we still expect a vote on government funding in the House, a vote on government funding in the House on Wednesday in the House, and this is what we were expecting all along. But furthermore, we're expecting that could be part of the final rounds of votes in the House this week. They were supposed to be in session through the end of the week, but now it appears they may truncate that schedule once they get this government funding cleared. And certainly the Senate stands poised to move this bill forward. But it is still going to be a bit of a heavy lift on the part of House Republicans. You know, the Speaker had some difficulty just yesterday trying to get this measure passed through the Rules Committee, so much so it actually got pulled from the committee and will now be passed under suspension of the rules, which basically means that there's going to be a 2/3 threshold required for this vote, meaning that Democrats are going to have to step in and help Republicans out, which has kind of happened time and again with these continuing resolution agreements. And this is something that many rank-and-file Republicans aren't necessarily too thrilled about, particularly those further on the right who feel that the Speaker time and again keeps kind of bending to Democratic demands. But on the same token, there's certainly the general consensus that no one really wants a shutdown right now, right before the presidential election, considering this is the last week that Congress will be in session.
Yeah, so potentially pushing the bigger battle till December 20th before the Congress ends and before the new president takes over. So let's turn to Antony Blinken. On what basis are House lawmakers recommending this contempt of Congress finding?
Well, this is something, and you very well know this, Scott. I mean, we have seen many attempts on the part of House Republicans to hold various administration officials in contempt of Congress or to take actions against them in light of certain policy differences and disagreements. In this case, we know that the House Foreign Affairs Committee has been conducting an investigation into the withdrawal of Afghanistan under the Biden administration. They put out a report recently over this, but the chairman of that panel, Mike McCall, has been trying for some time now to get Secretary of State Antony Blinken to testify, and Democrats, for their part, too, want to hear from the Secretary of State. However, the invitation that was extended to him, and it wasn't an invitation, it was a subpoena for him to appear today, obviously is in conflict with what you heard our colleague Weijia Jiang talk about, which is the UN General Assembly, which is where the Secretary of State is right now with President Biden. So for that reason, he could not be at today's hearing. And so that is why the panel moved forward with these contempt proceedings. And the Speaker also told reporters earlier today that certainly if this continues to advance, that it may be something that they take up within the lame duck session. But the Secretary, for his part, said, look, I tried to reach out to the committee me personally. I tried to reach out to the chairman personally to try to reschedule, to try to find another date. The panel and the chairman, Mike McCall, on the other hand, feel that Blinken has been stonewalling them. Democrats on the committee are furious over all of this. They just feel that this process has really been politicized and is completely unnecessary.
Let's pivot over to the Senate and the presidential race. Vice President Harris today said she supports eliminating the Senate filibuster so that Roe versus Wade can be codified into federal law. We've got a question about that, but first let's hear from the vice president.
I've been very clear. I think we should eliminate the filibuster for Roe, and we need and get us to the point where 51 votes would be what we need to actually put back in law the protections for reproductive freedom.
Nicole, she didn't just say that. She said that to a targeted audience in a battleground state. What are some of the lawmakers saying on the Hill in reaction to that?
Yeah, well, clearly not the target audience in the sense that many lawmakers disagree with her, including some of her former Democratic colleagues. You know, we certainly have seen some of the more independent lawmakers like Senator Kirsten Sinema, for instance, come out saying that this is short-sighted. She has been a staunch defender of using the filibuster and keeping that in place. As you see there, you know, she calls it an absolutely terrible and short-sighted idea. Also, Joe Manchin was asked about this as well. He says that he doesn't intend to support the vice president in this presidential contest. He, too, someone who is a Democrat who has since now turned independent. So that being said, and of course, Republicans, for their part, many of them completely disagree with the vice president on this one and could likely use this against her. You know, many congressional Republicans paint the vice president as one of the most liberal senators. We have heard that from the former president himself on the campaign trail. So this is likely to be further fodder to add to their campaign arguments on the trail as lawmakers set to recess here this week.
At the U.S. Senate with us, Nicole Killian. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Personal traits over policy. The new CBS News polling that's taking a look at how voters feel about the different candidates' characteristics. You're streaming America Decides. Brand new CBS News polling reveals candidates' personal qualities matter more to Harris supporters than Trump supporters. 72% of Harris supporters say personal qualities are very important to their vote, while only 39% of Trump supporters say so. Let's talk about this some more. Bring in our political panel, Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Rocha. Chuck's a Democratic strategist, was senior advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. And Leslie's a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. Well, that's a big difference, 72% and 39%. What do you make of the importance of that?
Well, people know who Trump is. You know, they're not trying to select a Valentine. They need a leader of the free world. And I think people would fundamentally understand what they're buying in terms of negotiating that. Harris is still that unknown, that undecided factor. So likability and how they're perceived is going to have a heavier weight, I think, for undecided voters than for Trump. They just, for Republicans, you had a lot of holding their nose and jumping in and supporting him in 2016. You saw consistent with that in 2020. I think Republicans are coming back around. They know he's leader of the party. They're going to support where they need to and fall in line, not in love, as we like to say. But it can make a difference in these tight margins.
Can the Harris campaign, can Democrats mechanize that somehow? Is there a way to fight that fight, or is he bulletproof on it?
This just in, personal qualities matter to Democrats, and they don't think Donald Trump has any. That's why you see people lining up that way. What we've seen with Donald Trump and motivation for Democrats is Donald Trump. People really love Donald Trump, and they really hate Donald Trump. What we're trying to look at now is what's the difference here to actually for a small group of undecided. As Leslie said, everybody knows Donald Trump. Everybody knows Democrats that are getting to know Kamala Harris, but it's baked in at almost 90%. There was more polling this weekend that said 90% of folks have kind of made up their mind, and there's only a small group of people in just a handful of states, like we were talking about off camera, that will actually make up the decisioning matter with just 1 or 2 points.
So who do we think those people are? Let me start with you. Who's still elastic right now?
Women voters. You have the Nikki Haley voters, right? They didn't necessarily come on board. They were really frustrated. You hear what these women talk about. I want somebody in the middle. Why can't I find somebody who's going to reach reach across, kind of harken back to establishment Republican, the golden days. They'll talk about Ronald Reagan. They felt that Nikki Haley filled that gap. They don't see that. They don't hear that. You don't see Nikki Haley on the stump for Trump. Something like that could really help close in those competitive races. I think even down ballot, that kind of thing. They don't feel, particularly their issues are being talked about. A lot of women are talking about economic, but why aren't they talking about it in context of childcare, context of putting food on the table and grocery prices? So I think there's some area for movement on both sides, and it's advantageous for us to listen to those voters as opposed to assume it's an election like any other.
Where do you mind for these people that are maybe persuadable?
It comes down to folks that have come of age in the last 4 years. Folks who've been voting in every election have made up their mind. I'm working in over 20 congressional races and 3 Senate races, and we do focus groups and polling. Folks have made up their mind who are regular, what we call prime voters. There's so many folks who've come of age. There's 1 million Latinos in Arizona and Nevada that have come of age. Just one example. The real question is, do they show up? Not just Latinos, but any young voter that's come of age. This is where the real unknown is. I take you back to 2016 and 2020 for that matter. There's a whole bunch of people who showed up for Donald Trump who no pollster ever polled because they were new voters.
As Democrats try to wrest the border security issue away from Republicans, they did so successfully in a special U.S. House race in February in New York. There seems to be, in a sense, the vice president's going to try to do that with a border visit Friday. How would you counsel your candidates to try to take that issue back from Republicans?
Let me tell you how I counsel them right now. There's a reason why Ruben Gallego is 15 points ahead of Trump or even Kerry Lake in Arizona, because he's a Marine, he's a father, and he's saying we can be a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws all at the same time. And I think if you look at where they're spending their money, is much more important than a border visit, but I think the border visit is very important. Tell me where your money is being spent to tell folks that you want a secure border and a fair immigration system.
I think and the counter to that, why it's really tough, is you've had 3.5 years to do that. Ruben Gallego is an outstanding candidate, I'll give you that, but he's also come from a military, law enforcement type background. Those types of candidates, whether they're Republican or Democrat, tend to do really well on the border enforcement because they earn the voters' trust. They say, if we're going to close the border, I'm going to handle the issue. People give them faith that they're going to do that. You never saw that faith was given to Harris early on in the administration, and she never really respected the voter to go and do the task, and I think that's why it's tough.
Let me bring it back to this issue of likability or personality being important. What does that say to you about female candidacy? There's got to be some dynamic that is unique here.
I'm so glad you asked. I wrote a book about it called You've Come a Long Way, Maybe, that talked about challenges particularly women candidates have in this case. I think if you look at the case of Hillary Clinton in a contrast to that, somebody who was, again, very well known, had very high negatives. Harris being an anomaly because she doesn't have, there's so many that really don't want to know her. They're giving her the benefit of the doubt. I will argue that. And it's an advantageous overall, but likability matters. You can go back to Kennedy and Nixon and the first debate, the charisma and style of a JFK really cemented that win. Even Trump against Hillary Clinton, the high negatives against a polarizing figure, but people respected and felt he was relatable.
Presidential campaigns are very different from your local congressional race. I've been running campaigns for 34 years, going back to Ann Richards. That's how old I am in Texas. Presidential campaigns are about likability and trust. Donald Trump got hired in 26 because people were tired of what they were feeling. Joe Biden got elected because they trusted him not to be Donald Trump. It was a COVID year. This presidential election is about who you trust and who you like. 70, 80% of folks have already made up their mind. When it comes down to it, it's not a deep dive on policy around the presidentials. It's around who you trust and who you like.
We have just a moment left. I want to get to one more thing. Ohio's Republican Senate candidate had some controversial remarks about abortion. Let me play that clip and ask you a question about it.
There's a lot of suburban women. A lot of suburban women that are like, listen, abortion's it. If I can't have an abortion in this country whenever I want, I will vote for anybody else. Okay, a little crazy, by the way, but especially for women that are like past 50.
Bernie Moreno got some criticism that he is playing into Democrats' hands by characterizing the abortion issue that way. What do you make of it?
It's well-deserved. I mean, I don't think you're going to talk to women rationally and reasonably and think that. Women have sisters, daughters, friends. They're concerned about their own family. This is an issue that extends beyond one generation to multiple generations in their household, and I think that it deserves the respect on both sides of the aisle to talk about it intelligently.
Look, there's something to be said about the scorn of an angry woman. And as an old Mexican from East Texas who's just been newly married for 38 days, I promise you, it took me that long to realize you don't mess with women or what women's rights are or anything that has to do with them that's got nothing for a hairy-legged old man like me to have any part of.
38 days going good so far?
So far, I can't believe it. So wonderful.
Congratulations, by the way, Chuck.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Leslie, Chuck, thank you both. Thanks for your time. Bitcoin, burgers, and bros. What former President Donald Trump is doing to reach this historically unreliable young male vote at the ballot box. You're streaming America Decides.
Is this your mugshot?
Yeah, can you believe it?
You're a gangster.
This is what we're reduced to. You know,
No way. No way.
should we put them on now? Yeah,
That's
crazy.
Podcasts like that one and UFC fights and cryptocurrency ventures. Donald Trump's campaign has made its mission to court young men, or as it's often called, to court the bro vote. For more on that, let's bring in Peter Hamby. He's host of Snapchat's Good Luck America. He's also a partner at Puck News, an exceptionally good writer and reporter. All right, Peter, walk us through how you define the bro vote, what it means, and what you make of Trump's efforts to court them.
First of all, Scott, thanks for calling me a good writer. That's the most flattering thing I've ever heard on television. Thanks. Look, these efforts are obvious. They seem like they're working if you look at the polls. You saw that clip there of Donald Trump going to a Bitcoin bar in New York. Donald Trump has been talking up crypto. He's even got his own NFTs that he's selling out there. Young men are in polls more likely to own crypto. In polls, Fairleigh Dickinson actually measured this. People who own crypto are more likely to support Donald Trump. People who don't, more likely to support Kamala Harris. Look, polls are all over the place with young men and young women. We see mixed data. The Harvard Youth poll that came out today saw that Donald Trump is doing better among young men, but he's getting clobbered among young women. Other polls, like a CNN poll today, showed the delta among young people to be closer than the Harvard poll, which showed Kamala Harris winning 60% of the youth vote overall. The bottom line here, though, is there is a distinct and obvious drift among young men away from the Democratic Party since 2020. And Donald Trump is trying to exploit that by going on Theo Vaughn, by going on Lex Friedman, by talking to the Nelk Boys and Logan Paul. These are all YouTube/podcast audiences with an audience that very much over-indexes on young men. The bottom line when it comes to elections is that Democrats, to win, have to win 60% of the youth vote. Joe Biden did that. Barack Obama did it twice. Hillary Clinton didn't, and she lost. Kamala Harris is right on that line. And if she doesn't shore up young men just a little bit, it could be bad for her at the polls. The upside for her, though, is that the gender gap is so big, she could make up for any shortcomings among young men by her huge margins among women of all ages. In particular, in the Harvard poll today, a 38-point lead among Gen Z women. Scott.
You host a pod. Is there something different or special about a podcast audience that makes them more desirable? Other than just a demographic group they represent that might be something you want. Is there something that connects a podcast audience with the guest more than doing a news interview or talking on the radio?
I think, one, if you are under the age of 30, you have completely come of age on social media, listening to content, news-focused or otherwise, that is fractured and splintered across social media platforms. And now, especially among podcasts. Podcasts, I feel like you have a closer relationship with the host. It's portable. But more to the point, young people just didn't grow up watching traditional linear television. They're watching live streams like this one, and they are watching video content on social media platforms, from YouTube to where I work at Snap. It's just that traditional media is completely outside the field of view for young people. And then you layer on top of that, podcast hosts, not me, but like a lot of them, they share a lot about themselves, and people feel like they have a personal relationship with those hosts. And it's sort of an identity marker in a way. If you listen to Lex Friedman, you're one of those guys who's just asking questions. Maybe you're a contrarian. That appeals, I think, a lot to young men these days.
Time for one more quick question, Peter. What type of policies do you see them trying to target to get a bro voter? What resonates with them?
Well, that's the thing. We talk about the bro vote. We need to break out the fact that, maybe in the case of some of these podcasts, you have a lot of young white men. Morning Consult did a poll of Joe Rogan listeners 2 years ago, Scott, and found that mostly white young men listen to it, but about a quarter of the audience is Hispanic. I think the thing is, a lot of this is branding for Donald Trump. He needs to talk more about the issue of the economy when he goes on these podcasts. Yes, there's a vibe. Young guys like Donald Trump. He plays golf with Bryson DeChambeau. He makes funny TikToks. He's anti-woke. The number one issue for young men is the economy. For young women, it's abortion rights. But for young men, it's the economy, prices, the cost of rent. Accessing the economy is a very difficult thing for young people these days. And so Donald Trump goes on these podcasts. He can act macho and talk about lowering taxes on Zins, but he does have to talk about the cost of living and really give people a why. Because, you know, he can't just, I think at least, he can't just go on there and be like, hey, I'm a dude, vote for me. There's got to be a little more of a transactional policy element going on.
Peter Hamby, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott.
As the world warms, are Americans taking the growing crisis into consideration when they vote? We'll discuss that after the break with some of our great CBS News reporters. You're streaming America Decides. One of the main points of discussion for world leaders meeting at this week's UN General Assembly is climate change. Data shows 2024 is on track to be the hottest year on record. And ahead of the election, CBS News is investigating how climate change may or may not influence voters as they cast their ballots. Joining us now is CBS News Philadelphia reporter Joe Holden, CBS News Colorado reporter Sean Boyd. Joe, let's start with you. Give us a sense of how climate change seems to be impacting voters in a particularly battleground area.
Yeah, Scott, good to be with you. So we focused on New Jersey's 2nd District, which takes in Atlantic and Cape May counties. It is the Jersey Shore. And what we've noticed in speaking with not only voters, but also the officials who are tasked with mitigating high water events. You know what's happening at the Jersey Shore more and more is it could be a sunny, it could be a warm day, not a cloud in the sky, no tropical systems to speak of, and water is flowing from the bay through bulkheads. They say that their dry streets more recently inundated, and this is happening more and more because of what they are saying, rising sea levels. We spoke to both an engineer and the mayor of a place called Wildwood Crest.
I feel like you're in the twilight zone because there's water in the street. Where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from the tide. The tide water is seeking its own level. There's been some patchwork installations done over the years.
Not working.
No, it's not.
As we continue to get these storms and as we continue to get sea level rise, we're actually trying to plan ahead to prevent this. And this is years down, this is, to prevent. We can see it happening now, but it's only going to get worse as the years go on. So we're going to take the time now to address it.
Yeah, Mayor Don Cabrera, they're saying they're acting now, but the question is, with NASA projections of a possible foot of sea level rise by 2050, is that going to be enough to compensate for those years ahead?
You're getting a sense from your reporting this is a pressing issue for voters as well, because we keep hearing about this delta between interest among some people in this issue and how much political leaders actually talk about it. Is this an issue you're finding, or the political leaders are finding, actually resonates with the constituents, with the voters?
Well, Scott, there seems to be, from our research, some disconnect. Let's talk about the congressman in New Jersey's 2nd District. His name is Jefferson Jeff Van Drew. He was a Democrat in 2018 and then did a party flip in 2019, and his voting record on pro-environmental legislation. Remember, these are parts of New Jersey very in step, very in tune. 2/3 believe that there is an effect due to climate change on what they are looking at and dealing at, weather related. Now, Van Drew's record goes from 90%. He's with the climate in 2018, 2019, and then it falls. It falls down to 3% just last year. We asked him about that scorecard. Remember, his votes in Washington, are they resonating? Are they in line? Are they connected to what we're seeing in South Jersey? Here's how he answered my question with that scorecard in mind.
You mentioned my scorecard is not particularly high by some folks on some of the environmental issues as related to climate change and the coast.
Well, how do you feel about that number right there? Not to interject, but that number itself doesn't sit well with you?
It doesn't sit well with me, but in some cases, because I don't think that the baseline that they use is necessarily accurate.
Now, in fairness to the congressman, he defended his stance. He said that he is against the forcing of electric vehicles. He believes that the IRA passed by Congress in 2022 indirectly supports China's boom in developing lithium-ion batteries, which, if there is a force to use EVs here in the United States, Jeff Van Drew wants that money, that business, that boom in the economy here. We should point out the IRA in 2022 did direct $70 billion for the development of that technology here domestically.
Joe Holden, thank you. Stand by. Let's turn to Sean now in Denver. Sean, you recently interviewed a family of third-generation farmers who live in Colorado. How has climate change directly impacted them?
You know, Scott, climate change is often associated with wildfires in Colorado, but it has also transformed our agricultural landscape. The ag industry is one of the top economic drivers in this state. And while water has always been a precious commodity in the West, as temperatures rise and rain patterns change, it's become even more so. And as a result of that drier climate, farmers like the one I spoke to, Mark Arnish, have literally altered the types of crops that they grow, planting those that are less water intensive. They've also gone high tech in an effort to conserve water, using this state-of-the-art technology to track how much water is in the soil and even how the crops are taking up that water. Arnish told me every industry, from farming to fracking, is being forced to adapt.
Things are changing. We recognize it. We may want to ignore it for a long time, but it's real. But I also believe that the American farmer will rise to that occasion, and he'll be part of that solution. The oil and gas industry will be part of this solution. We all have a stake to play in this thing, and let's quit playing politics and let's get down to the science.
Arnish, who is a Republican, says the science is indisputable, but he says many in his community are still climate deniers. Scott.
Sean, what are you hearing from Colorado's legislators, those members of Congress who have some responsibility over this issue and over these districts? What are they saying about this?
In the district I focused on, Congressional District 4 is solidly Republican. Trump won it by double digits in 2016 and 2020. And the voters there haven't sent a Democrat to Congress for 16 years. It's why Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who barely won re-election in 2022, switched to this district when incumbent Ken Buck retired. And Boebert is a climate denier, and one of the things her new district has in common with her old district is a big oil and gas presence. Her record has been one of supporting fossil fuels and opposing any action on climate change. Still, Mark Arnish, that farmer that I talked to, said while he's a climate believer, he will likely vote for Boebert because climate is not his top issue. And he thinks Boebert will be more supportive when it comes to farm policies. Also, while half the jobs in Colorado are now green energy jobs, oil and gas still employs many of Arnish's neighbors and provides a lot of tax revenue in this district.
Sean Boyd, Joe Holden, good work, both of you. Thank you very much. Now to Capitol Hill, where a statue of Johnny Cash has been unveiled at the U.S. Capitol. Earlier today, the man in black became the second public figure to represent Arkansas in Statuary Hall. Here's House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries on why Johnny Cash was chosen for this honor.
Few artists have done more to live out the prophecy of John Adams than Johnny Cash. Throughout his life, he created a catalog of profoundly powerful works that cannot be ascribed to a single genre.
Members of the Cash family were there for the unveiling. The singer is shown holding a Bible in his hand and a guitar on his back. That does it for today. We're back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.